I think it will be even more tangible than the last two ones. So if you felt that perhaps the previous sessions were a little bit too abstract, this one will have more architectural content than the previous ones. And it's obviously, I mean, it's a very long one. It is maybe too comprehensive the way I approach it, and maybe too shallow. I mean, there are too many things, but what I would like is to give an array of interesting points that can be, that you can perhaps research in more depth in the in the future, related to the subject of energy, which in this kind of idea that we are revising the elements, the arcane elements would be equivalent to the fire element. Obviously cities need energy to function, transporting goods and people to a place with a very dense concentration of population requires a whole logistic system that is feeding the population. And going back to history, Vitruvius, and we always go back to Vitruvius because it's the first, the arcane of architectural theory. Vitruvius places fire at the origin of cities in his book De Architectura. So Vitruvius already mentions fire as a very important element for urbanism, and it is interesting that Alberti, some centuries later, also one of the arcanes of architectural theory, says the opposite, and I think that this is an interesting relationship that I would like you to think about, because Alberti in his book 1 chapter 2 says that architecture emerges from the enclosure, from the envelope, from the walls and the roof that build the primitive hut. So on one side you can see that fire is at the origin of a whole lineage of architectural conception, and on the other side it is the enclosure, the capacity to build limits and to enclose spaces and to engage with the flows of energy that are present in the environment, that forms the core of architecture, or the core of cities. There is a theorist that I would like to also refer to, who is a Spanish theorist called Fernández Galiano, that talks about combustion and construction as the two sides of dealing with energy. He basically says that an architecture of combustion is an architecture that exploits the accumulated energy in the earth, while an architecture of construction, which will be the kind of Albertian side of this dichotomy, is the regulation of free energy. So you can imagine that on Earth there are deposits of energy which are concentrated in matters, so in coal, in petroleum, in wood, that you can release by burning. So that's basically active energies, fossil fuels, etc., etc. But there are other energies like wind and water and and the earth as a kind of source of energy, which are perhaps less concentrated forms of energy that architecture has traditionally exploited. So if you can think about what in architecture is called or is understood generally as active systems versus passive systems, that is the equivalence to the architecture of combustion and the architecture of construction. Fire, as I was saying, it lies at the core of cities, following Vitruvius, but it's interesting that fire predates agrarian urban society. So the tribes of hunter-gatherers were already using fire before agriculture, before urban forms of settlements. And I think that is also interesting to understand energy or fire. I mean, if we are making this equation of energy and fire, that energy takes many different forms, and one of the forms that it takes is animal power. I mean, there is also human power, but one of the first non-human form of energy was to basically use animals, the power of animals to do things, to transform the environment. So for example, to kind of cultivate the land, all ancient cultures use animals as the most arcane form of energy. But the energy, the fire energy, as we understand it more commonly, is actually the burning of deposits of energy that can be released in combustion. And for example, one of the things that I mean, if you read Levi-Strauss, I don't know whether you know the book The Raw and the Cook from Claude Levi-Strauss, a famous structuralist and anthropologist, French anthropologist. He talks about the raw and the cooked. So cooking is also one of the forms in which societies come together. So fire becomes therefore one of the centers of human communities. But there are other forms of energy, as I was saying before, referring to Galeano's idea of construction, and those have to do with the exploitation of flows of air and flows of water, which are the two elements that we have seen in the past. And again, I want you to keep reminding that the elements are connected to each other. And so there are translations between air and energy and water and energy, and those are enabled by these machines, the water wheel and the windmill, which are also ancient forms of obtaining energy from the environment without necessarily burning things. Burning things is obviously a very efficient way of obtaining energy, and it predated actually the invention of these other forms of obtaining energy from the environment, and it is again thought by some architects, famously Frank Lloyd Wright used to talk about the hearth as the center of the home, of the domestic environment, and used to locate the fireplace almost as the core from which domesticity radiates. And again, looking at this dichotomy between an architecture of construction and architecture of combustion, this would be the combustion model, the model of Wright, while the model of the primitive hut, the envelope, is the alternative model of using the energy of the environment, or creating an artificial climate, if you want, very local artificial climate that makes human life more comfortable. So if we go to beyond fire, I mean, we're going to talk now mostly about burning or an architecture of combustion. If you look further, after human tribes started extracting energy from burning wood, they developed increasingly sophisticated forms of fuels or materials that would be able to release energy. The first one was charcoal. Charcoal requires a certain treatment of wood, and what charcoal does is that it produces out of the wood, basically the way you produce charcoal is by burning partially wood and removing parts of the wood, so that what remains is a type of fuel that doesn't produce smoke, so you can use it in the home, for example, without smoking the whole place. But it also has the quality that it burns at a much higher temperature than wood. So you can obtain much higher temperatures out of burning charcoal than out of burning wood. And for example, metallurgy, so the manipulation of, or the production and manipulation of iron and steel would not have been possible without that change between wood and charcoal. So charcoal enabled metallurgy, and metallurgy is obviously one of the materials that humans use to produce weapons and to produce tools with which they use to, for example, agricultural purposes. So these are kilns, traditional kilns, which is the way charcoal is produced. And the third form that sources of burning materials takes is coal, and coal is almost like a layer of charcoal that has become mineralized and naturally mineralized, and it has even more capacity than charcoal. It's more powerful. There is more energy contained in coal than in wood and in charcoal, so relatively early humans discover that source of energy, of deposits of energy in nature, that was more difficult to extract because you had to resort to mining. That's kind of a Japanese mine, an old coal mine in Japan, and obviously people had to go inside of the earth. They have to dig the earth in order to extract this form of energy, which was so much more powerful that famously Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American poet, was absolutely astonished by it. Used to say that charcoal is almost like having climate in your pocket. So the whole industrial revolution happens because humans started to burn charcoal that had an even higher content of energy, and that is what produced the industrial revolution, the steam engines, and so on and so forth. So what you can see here is that humans are discovering historically increasingly more powerful forms of energy. And as humans have access to increased levels of energy, civilization or culture develops. I think that this is a very important consideration right now. Right now, there is a lot of people, as we have said in the past sessions, saying that we need to stop using energy because of the environmental consequences but there are many people who are saying humans have developed only because of increased use of energy. And there are other people who are saying there are no, I mean, we mentioned this case, there are no developed societies that don't have high energy demand. So there is a kind of correlation between the amount of energy that is sourced by a certain culture and the development of that culture, the level of development of that culture. And I would encourage you, I think I already mentioned also this book, The History of Energy from Václav Smil, which has a very detailed set of data that explain that correlation, historical correlation, and also gives you a sense of the scale of the power that different sources of energy are able to deliver. So if you see some of these diagrams, you see how much human labor can provide, then animal labor, then water wheels, then windmills, and then basically what is the proportion that exists between animal farm energy to internal combustion engines, or how in the kind of olden days, like this goes back to 1700, and you can see that most of the energy that human societies used was basically human and animal energy. And how now basically the proportion of human and animal energy that we use to power our cities and our societies is minimal, and most of it comes of burning fossil fuels. And so there are, I mean, there is a lot of material about this that gives you a sense of the scale of the increase of energy that have developed, particularly in developed societies. For example, there is this chart which is actually quite interesting. Europe 10,000 before Christ. This is the amount of energy per capita, and the sources or the uses of that energy, and this is the US in the 1990s. So the proportion of energy that one person consumes is far bigger. It's 100 times bigger than it used to be. And so there are many people who are saying it is impossible to have access to higher levels of civilization without a very high consumption level. But I mean, you can look at these charts in the Smil book if you are interested about looking at this. But obviously we know now that the drawback of obtaining energy from fossil fuels is that we produce carbon. And we throw carbon to the atmosphere. You see the increase of carbon emissions in billions of tons of CO2 between or starting to rise in the 50s until now, and it also kind of becomes 25 times bigger, and it depends also on the country. There are countries that are consuming more and more energy. And so that obviously is what has generated these concerns that we cannot keep extracting or taking from the earth these pockets of concentrated energy that Waldo Emerson was saying it's like having the climate on your pocket. It gives you an enormous power, but there are people there are many people who believe that we can no longer keep doing these things and taking this energy out of the earth systematically and producing heat island effects in cities and so on and so forth. So obviously the range of energy that is consumed in different places varies, and there are countries like mostly the US and Australia and maybe Saudi Arabia that consume an enormous amount of energy resources per capita, and other countries do not reach the same levels of consumption. So there is a kind of this is actually an interesting diagram, because that refers also to the other relationship, like transversal relationship that we have mentioned before, which is the synthesis of ammonia. So this is the amount of energy that is consumed in synthesizing ammonia, which has become exponentially lower over time since it is discovered at the beginning of the 20th century to now. The consumption required to produce ammonia is much lower than it used to be, but nevertheless it is the amount of energy that is used to produce food, to produce agriculture, is actually surprisingly large. So let's kind of go now to the Industrial Revolution, which is probably the moment in which this hunger for energy starts almost violently. There are certain types of architecture that are produced because of this hunger for energy and this capacity to produce high levels of energy by burning fossil fuels. Probably the paradigm of the Industrial Revolution building is the Crystal Palace, a building that is entirely made out of, well, it's actually made out of wood, surprisingly. Probably you thought it was steel and glass, but actually a large amount of the substructure of these envelopes is made of wood and then painted black, as if it was, but I mean, it has some, the basic structure is iron, but it has actually many members that are still made out of timber, and it's glass, so two elements that are again demanding a lot of energy. So to produce iron, to produce glass, to maintain, to heat this building requires a lot of energy. This type of architecture would not be possible without the access to certain types of embodied energy. We already saw or referred to this air conditioning model in which energy is used to climatize the inside of buildings. And also, I mean, this also happens during the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of an energy paradigm in architecture that is consuming energy to heat or cool air in order to maintain the climate inside of the buildings. And it is also interesting that at this time is when greenhouses appear. So these and greenhouses, paradoxically, and we will see it later on, are the typology of architecture that uses these high embodied energy materials, glass and steel, in order to produce energy from the sun, to retain energy from the sun because of greenhouse effects. So right after the Industrial Revolution, already at the beginning, just at the border between the 19th and the 20th century, buildings have become a sophisticated industry, and there are some relationships that I would like you to think about between the availability of energy and especially certain types of energy and the materialization of those buildings. Now, in this image there, you see 3 buildings at the top and 3 buildings at the bottom. Which ones? I don't know whether I put the the dates of the buildings there, but which ones do you think are older? The ones at the top or the ones at the bottom? The ones at the bottom are older. Why? Because they have less glass. Okay, the answer is exactly the opposite, surprisingly. Because I mean, anybody would have answered exactly what you answered, but it is funny because it's exactly the opposite. The buildings on the upper row are buildings that, I mean, there are buildings built in Chicago around the turn of the century. The ones at the top are built just before the 1900. The ones at the bottom are built a few years after. You know why that is? Because so there are different theories about this. There are the theories of the theorists, Giedion, and there are the theories of the practitioners who were building these buildings, John Hollabaird. So Giedion says that the reason why this happens is that the Chicago World Exhibition, which was a famously neoclassical architecture designed by or planned by Burnham, happens in between in 1893, and that basically convinces architects that classicism or neoclassicism is the architecture of modern mercantilism. That's the theory of Giedion. I am much more interested in the theory of Hollabaird, who says the reason why this happens is that I mean, one of the interesting things about this whole thing is that at the same time as the international exhibition is neoclassical, is the first international exhibition where there is a systematic use of electricity to light the spaces. So if you look at some of the exhibits of the Chicago exhibition, you see there all the kind of General Electric, all the electricity companies. I mean, before the 1900, electricity was not yet available for mass use in cities. But it is at this point that suddenly most of the energy consumption in cities, or not most of the energy consumption, but the substantial, the energy that is used to lit cities becomes electrical. And so that means that it becomes very easy and very cheap to lit buildings by using electricity, and that electricity has become increasingly available and cheap. And so what Hollabier says is that it wasn't the neoclassical neoclassical trend that produced that change. It was the fact that Chicago is a cold place in winter, and these glass buildings were efficient when you had to lit the spaces by natural daylight. So people wanted to have as many windows as possible, and glass had become cheap at the time. So buildings started becoming more transparent. But the drawback of that is that they require more energy to heat them, because glass obviously was not as a good insulating envelope as stone. And so what Hollabier says is people realize that yes, you can get more daylight, but since now we have electricity and we can lit buildings by using electricity, we don't need the glass. And that's why buildings became more opaque at the time. So I mean, this is for you to understand that you know, Westinghouse, all these companies were some of the main exhibits that happened in Chicago. So it was neoclassical style wrapping around electricity companies. What was happening in Chicago, and so there is this graph, which is, I think this graph is maybe, no, I don't think this is from Schmil. I can't remember where I got this graph, but basically what happens is that there is a moment which you can, so this is the price per kilowatt. So you can see that as electricity becomes more available in cities, the price of kilowatt per hour diminishes, and there is I mean, the price of production of glass goes very low at some point, so it's very affordable. So buildings are, I mean, architects are more enticed to use glass as building material for walls. But there is a moment in which the price of glass becomes increasingly expensive, because there is in the Chicago area there is a gas how do you say gas resource that becomes depleted. So Chicago requires so much energy that the reserves of gas in the underground become depleted. So energy starts becoming increasingly expensive. And there is a moment, which is more or less around the 1900, where the price of glass exceeds by far the price of using energy. And so you can see that maybe what architects want to believe is some sort of stylish, fancy trend is bullshit, because basically what is happening there are much deeper processes that have to do with economies and resources. So energy, I mean, after this kind of turn of the century, energy becomes obviously a big inspiration for artists. Energy and movement and machinery becomes a great inspiration for artists. Boccioni, for example, but also Santelia. The power stations, the electricity towers become almost like a trend if you want, like something that has a certain aesthetic content that artists and architects become very interested in engaging with, and there is a lot of people who make incredibly mad ideas about energy that will transform perhaps the world. I mean, this is a famous project by an architect called Hermann Sergel from the 20s, who proposed to build a series of dams around the Mediterranean, so that these huge dams will and then lower the level of the Mediterranean Sea, so that these dams produce enough energy to supply the whole of Europe while making available some areas around the Mediterranean. So there is a kind of incredible attraction and interest in the whole production of energy just before the stock market crisis of 1929, where, as you know, the stock market crisis collapsed. And what is the immediate result of this? That energy becomes very expensive. I mean, I think it's important to see this session also in the light of what is happening now, for example, with the Ukrainian war and the kind of shortage of oil and gas, Russian gas supply to Germany and to Europe, and how these phenomena end up having an impact on architecture. I think it's important for you to think about this, because as we were seeing before, I think that we need to reinvent ourselves as a profession, and we better start looking at how the profession relates to these global political, economic processes. So one of the things that happened in the stock market crash is that it triggered an enormous hunger for insulation materials, to the point that just the year after the 29, it was very difficult and very expensive to buy insulation materials. So people before were simply burning fuels, and so it is interesting that you go almost from an architecture and an economy of combustion to an economy of construction, in the words of Fernandez Galeano, and we will see that situation happening in other moments along the history of the 20th century, in terms of that engagement between energy regimes and architectural constructs or architectural typologies, if you want. So 1939, a few years after the stock market crash, I mean, we already mentioned this, so we don't. I mean, this basically is a point that I've already made. It's kind of repeated, so maybe I will not look at that, but it is interesting to see how Wright is talking about the hearth and an architecture in a way of combustion to a degree, as the center of the home makes this home, which is called is in Wisconsin, and it's called the solar hemicycle, and it has this kind of glass gallery. I mean, it's entirely wrongly designed, because if you really wanted to profit from the sun, you would have made the curve in the other direction, no? But intuitively, he is interested in saying, okay, this is a house that, as opposed to burning fossil fuels, is going to actually use the sun as a source of comfort inside of the house. And then, you know, after the 1939, there is again the emergence out of the crisis after the Second World War. Nuclear energy, who has been made available because of military technology, becomes possible, a new possible source of energy that is so powerful, so much more powerful than burning fossil fuels, that some of the more enthusiastic people at the time were saying that energy, through atomic energy would become so affordable that it will be too cheap to meter. So it wouldn't matter how much energy you would consume. You would maybe pay a fixed amount for the facility to produce energy, and then you can consume as much as you want. So this is kind of burst of optimism in the post-war and the return of an architecture of glass. So immediately after this, we start seeing this type of buildings, which is almost a return to those buildings that had been abandoned in Chicago at the turn of the century, the kind of classical curtain wall, glass curtain wall buildings in Manhattan are, I mean, it's also very interesting that the investment in the city during the Depression diminishes, so the stock market crashes, people abandon the city, move all the investments to the factories in the Midwest. I mean, this is a little bit American-centered. I admit that, but at the same time, you know, it's not. I mean, I'm European by birth, and actually, the avant-garde of this relationship to energy happens in America at that time. No other culture has that deep engagement with energy. But so one of the things that is interesting, Lever House is actually the first building built in Manhattan after maybe probably the last high rises that are built in Manhattan date back from immediately after 39 are the Rockefeller Center, which were built actually already during or after the crisis, but the developers almost went bankrupt. There are, I mean, this is part of another seminar, but basically, Lever House is almost like a statement of confidence that the stock market is going to come back, that the stock market crisis has passed, that the war has ended, and that the future is bright. And so the buildings, again, can consume a lot of energy and can be entirely made out of glass. And so that produces a certain typology. There are other people around the time that are, I mean, we've seen already some of these things from Le Corbusier, talking about glass envelopes and air conditioning as the main source of environmental comfort in buildings. And it's also interesting to see how after these experiments from Le Corbusier into glass envelopes that are sustained by air conditioning supply, Le Corbusier goes all the way back to the arcane ideas of some sort of continuity between the outside and the inside, and it becomes interested in the solar cycles. And this probably happens, and this is also a funny story, which is the story of the Cité de Refuge in Paris, a building built by Le Corbusier in 1933, which is a hospital. You can see on the picture of the left is the building as it was finished in 1933. So Le Corbusier originally planned a system of a double glass envelope that was following his own principle of the respiration exact. So his theory was by supplying hot air into this cavity in the facade, he would be able to keep the the environment comfortable. It was bullshit. It was completely the wrong theory, and he was in fact told by Carrier, the American blower corporation. I mean, the American blower corporation is the ancestor of Carrier, the air conditioning supplier in the States. And he talked to them and they told him, you're wrong, you're gonna crash against reality. But not only he did crash against reality, but also the client said, why are we going to build a double glass wall? So the building was built with a single glass wall. And apparently the summer it opened, it was a hospital, it was entirely unlivable. It was a disaster climatically. He was lucky enough that this building was bombed in the Second World War the year after, so the facade was destroyed, and then he was commissioned to rebuild it after the war, and he rebuilt it with brisolails. So the brisolails were almost like the shift from the closed envelope to the reaction to the sun, to the reaction to not using combustion as the source of energy, but shaping the building so that it would profit or shield itself from solar exposure. Moving forward through history, then there is the 1973 crisis, which basically became a huge collapse of the post-war technology of air conditioning and high energy consumption. So what James Marston Fitch calls thermal steady state across time and across space. So if you want to look at an interesting book about the energy situation in American buildings in the 70s, you should read Fitch book, which is called American Building, the Environmental Forces That Shape It. And this is a building that is published in 1972. And it talks about air conditioning systems and sealed envelopes and so on and so forth. But so 1973, the OPEC, the organization of countries that produce oil, suddenly makes some sort of embargo, and the price of oil barrels becomes 10 times more expensive. And so that produces shortages of oil, but again, a crisis. And so this is, again, I want to insist in this session in this relationship between economic processes and political processes and architectural paradigms. So what happens in 1973 is that basically energy becomes again expensive, like it had happened at the end or immediately after the stock market crash in 29. And the same thing occurs. So there is a kind of crisis. Richard Nixon talks about or invents or proposes what he called Project Independence, which was announced in November 7th, 1973, which is a reaction against the oil embargo from OPEC. And he basically says something very similar to what German people are saying now in the absence of Russian gas and oil, which is that we need to become independent energetically. We cannot rely on fossil fuels that come from another country. So this is Richard Nixon in 1973, but the oil crisis continues, and there is this also very famous event when Jimmy Carter in 1978 makes what was known as the cardigan speech, where he is sitting down in the White House with a cardigan, saying, don't use energy, just put a jumper over. Don't turn the air conditioning on, and so there is this kind of interest of politicians immediately after the oil crisis of 1973 that the way in which we need to condition the environment needs to fundamentally change by becoming independent or less reliant on foreign fossil fuels and more reliant on other things. Famously also, Jimmy Carter installed solar panels in the White House. And this is in 1979, two years after his famous cardigan speech. He made this facility of solar panels, which at the time were incredibly inefficient, and but nevertheless he realized that was maybe the alternative to consuming fossil fuels. And I mean, you have to imagine the price of solar panels have dropped nearly 100% since Jimmy Carter installed solar panels in the White House. And it's also very funny because he installed the solar panels and then Ronald Reagan removed them in 1996. And then Obama reinstalled them in, when was Reagan, 30 years later, I can't remember, but anyway, Obama in 2014 or whatever reinstalled the solar panels in the White House. So this becomes almost like a very clear relationship between this energy, between politics and energy, and obviously politics and architecture eventually. So more pictures of, and again the same thing happens that had happened after the 29 crisis, which is that the demand for insulation materials bursts. Basically, there is no way of getting insulation materials in the US because there is such a demand for insulation materials in the country. All these are ads in the newspapers of how to become independent energetically, how to insulate, how insulation will keep your energy bill down, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens after this? People invent something that is called EIFS, EIFS, external insulation facade systems. And you will I mean, I'm sure that in Seoul there are some cases, but actually not very many. This is a material that at some point in the United States was, I don't know, 12% of all the commercial construction was using EIFS. EIFS is basically is this stuff. Is this kind of plasticky postmodern architecture that emerges in the 80s is all built with EIFS. And EIFS is almost like styrofoam with a layer of some sort of resin bond that makes the styrofoam resistant to impact. So you can basically wrap the whole building. So instead of having the insulation inside, which is less efficient because there are cold bridges through the facade and to the slabs, etc., you wrap the whole building in a layer of insulation that is sufficiently strong to withstand impact. And so these buildings or this building, this is Aratai Sosaki, this kind of plasticky stuff is all made with that you know what it is? Can you think about buildings like this in Seoul? No? I don't think it's so common here. I think this, and it's not so common either in Europe. It is, in fact, the patent is originally German, and it was made to reconstruct all buildings after the war in Germany, but was not successful. And then somebody, some kind of industrialist, bought the patent, took it to the US, and then it exploded there. The American name is Drive It. So that is an interesting, and so these photographs there, those are Pietro Belluschi is the old guy, and the other one is Michael Graves, who is the author of the Portland Municipal Service Building, which was one of the most iconic architectural buildings made at the time. And you know who Pietro Belluschi was? Pietro Belluschi was the author of probably the first fully working curtain wall building, which was built in Portland, and it was called the Equitable. You can look at it. It's an incredible building. It predates the Lever House and all these other New York buildings. So Pietro Belluschi basically developed the technology of the Equitable building because he realized that after the war there was incredible surplus capacity in the industry to build aluminum. So aluminum was a building material that was unaffordable before the Second World War, and it was developed in order to build airplanes. And so there was a lot of airplanes built with aluminum during the war, and they built huge factories to build this. So the whole military industrial American complex went crazy about aluminum. And then when the war ended, suddenly they didn't know what to do with the aluminum, the aluminum capacity that they had produced. So Belluschi realized that aluminum was very cheap and was potentially able to be used for buildings instead of for airplanes. And it was very cheap because basically they had built so much capacity they didn't know what to do with it. And so he built the first aluminum curtain wall in Portland. And then he became the dean of MIT, and he sold his company to, you know who? Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. So the whole technology of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill was developed by Pietro Belluschi. And so Pietro Belluschi was a native of Portland, and he was really angry that Michael Graves was building this horrible eaves insulated instead of, Pietro Belluschi was basically an architect of curtain walls and glass and so on and so forth, and he was very pissed off that Michael Graves, and so they had dinner and so on, they tried to kind of make up, but that kind of conflict between the paradigm of the post-war and the paradigm of after the 1973 oil crisis is very visible, architecturally speaking also. And so, there is this, and so, again, so there is solar panels, there is insulation that developed after the oil crisis, and then there is the very famous book Entropy from Jeremy Rifkin, which is really a jewel that I also recommend you to take a look at, where he basically starts talking about the contemporary world as a new system of organizing energy and relating to in some ways, what Rifkin says in this book is that the modernist industrial paradigm has ended and we are entering into what he calls some sort of thermodynamic world. So the world is no longer the world of the Industrial Revolution, is a different world in terms of energy regimes. And there's a number of people who work in this new world by developing further solar technologies, but they develop it by using this kind of solar panels and mirrors and things like that. It's actually very interesting that the guy who is investigating these systems is Felix Trombe, the guy who invented the Trombe wall. Have you heard about the Trombe wall before? This is Felix Trombe and the Trombe wall. So the Trombe wall basically is a wall that covers the south face of the building in glass and puts a wall behind, a solid wall behind, so that because of the greenhouse effect, it heats up the chamber and it transfers the heat to a very heavy wall inside. And then by opening vents on the bottom and the top of the wall, you can also use that cavity in the summer to produce by chimney effect to extract air and refresh the space inside. And so this type of paradigms produce one of my favorite examples of buildings, which are what is called the earthships in America in the late 70s, 80s. Many people moved to California. They're kind of hippies. They are dropouts. They don't want to be on the net, on the grid, exactly. They want to live off grid, and so one of the things they do is they become independent energy-wise. So, like Richard Nixon in the Project Independence in 1973 said we need to become independent. These guys say we have to become off-grid and independent from society that is corporate and capitalist and blah, blah, blah. And the technologies they resort to are technologies of Trombe and the solar collectors, basically. And so this is a kind of little collection of buildings like that. I'm just putting them as curiosities because they are mostly self-built, but using that type of technology that was developed by scientists on the cusp of that, or as a result of that change of energy. So you see, they use adobe and glass. So they are very heavy buildings. They have a lot of mass, but they also have glass that, through greenhouse effect, heated the building, and they're in the middle of the desert in Arizona or in California, and they all have these kind of galleries that become the new hearth of the building. But this time it's not a hearth that is burning fuel, like in the case of Wright, but it's a hearth that is exploiting the power of the sun to produce environmental conditioning. So just kind of at that same moment, there is a kind of whole scene in the arts also that start looking at the phasing out of fossil fuels. These are the pictures from Edward Burtynsky that show oil tankers that are being dismantled in in India, or piles of rubber tiles. So it's almost like the phasing out, how the phasing out of an energy regime becomes embraced by the arts to produce this kind of dystopian images of this technology as an obsolete technology. This is Ferropolis in Germany, with these huge machines that are now disabled, so they become museum pieces, and they were used to extract coal from the land. And at the same time, maybe another example of this almost dystopian monumentalization of a regime of high energy consumption, this project for a real site, which is the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. So in Arizona, there is this place that is used to keep nuclear waste. You know, nuclear waste, once it is burned, it is dangerous, it is radioactive, and needs to be stored for 1 million years. It's crazy, but I mean, these things are maybe going to exceed by far the life of our civilization, and we are basically burying this stuff. And so there is a very interesting project from a professor at Harvard called Peter Gallison, who this is the plan, this Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Facility, which exists and basically stores a huge amount of nuclear waste. But so Peter Gallison made this project with an artist, I can't remember, maybe I'll have the name later on, who says, well, maybe humankind expires before this nuclear waste is expires also, because in 1 million years, God knows who will exist on Earth. So we need to build something that will prevent future inhabitants of the Earth, that in that location there is this highly dangerous material stored. And so he makes this. Ramos is the artist that makes. I mean, they start speculating about how are we going to monumentalize this phasing out of a moment of high energy consumption. But also to make an actual sign that piece of land is going to remain radioactive for 1 million years. And so moving to the current possibilities and the current situation, what we are seeing now, after these kind of episodes in the 70s and the 80s, is that, and this is a diagram made by Stefan Belling, who is one of the directors at Foster and Partners, but also a kind of theorist, and is reworked by Iñaki Ábalos, that if you look at the architecture in the past, the architectural form is mostly what contributes to the energy regimes in buildings. And the active systems, so the systems that burn energy, are the smallest amount. So most of the comfort is produced by the form of the building itself, by the walls, by the, let's say, the architecture of construction, versus the architecture of combustion is very similar to the power systems versus the the active systems. So what we see in the modern era is that architecture becomes mostly reliant, or the environmental control or conditioning of buildings becomes mostly reliant on active systems, and an architectural form is relatively unimportant. So I think what maybe is the potential of this energy crisis is that architectural form in the near future is going to become again much more important than energy systems. Because obviously if we can resolve the energy problem by insulating the buildings or using natural ventilation or natural daylight, etc., systems that enable to control the environment without resorting to tap into the storages of energy on Earth, we will obviously avoid carbon emissions, etc. So, I mean, going back to the urban heat island, this is something that will also have an urban impact. And if you think about the impact in the environmental control that global warming and urban heat island has, so the urban heat island effect may hit the environment of the city by up to 10 degrees. If you think about this, when we are talking about global warming, we are talking about staying below 2 degrees. So the urban heat island is even much more urgent and much more important to address than the global warming, because more than half of the population on the Earth are living already in cities. And so if cities have an increase of 10 degrees, you have to just imagine the importance that this has in terms of heating or cooling buildings, maintaining environmental comfort in buildings compared to global warming. Here, I mean, these are sort of basic graphics about embodied energy versus operational energy in different cases. But we're not going to kind of detail on that. I would like to also mention to you something that again comes from meteorology. So meteorologists talk about the Earth energy budget or the surface energy budget, and this is a concept that is now starting to become used in architecture, because the same as the Earth has a relationship to the to the energy intakes from the sun and the flows of water and air and so on and so forth. There is a kind of balance between the energy that we receive from the sun and the energy that is reflected or absorbed into the Earth. And if you equate this idea of Earth energy budget to buildings, which is something that we are starting to do now, then you can much more easily understand what are the impacts of doing certain things to buildings. We already saw this graph in the air session, but basically by extending the surface of the Earth through the buildings, what we are doing is increasing the amount of surface that is absorbing solar energy. And therefore we are always going to have, in a more rugged urban topography, a higher intake. So by nature, cities are going to have a higher energy budget than the kind of rural environments, and that has to do with this. I mean, basically the energy that we receive. I mean, Elon Musk was saying it just a few days ago, that I mean, we already discussed that basically the energy that the Earth receives from the sun is like 100 times bigger than the energy that that humankind needs to sustain itself on a comfortable level, and so that very energy is the energy that is producing the heat turbine effect, except that the heat turbine effect is unintended and not controlled, or hasn't been controlled until recently, because we haven't applied certain principles of energy budget to buildings yet. But some of the components of this surface energy budget, this is this thing that I asked you, and you told me that you have never heard about it, but this is very important. What is called albedo, and the albedo of a building surface is the amount of reflection that the surface of the building makes. So from the 100% of energy that comes from the sun, the surface of the building reflects 80% when a building has a very high albedo. But a building with a low albedo is attracting energy, basically absorbing energy, therefore contributing to increased heat island effects. I mean, I have had this experience in a building that we designed in London a few years ago, where we were using tiles of different colors. Some tiles were black, some tiles were silver. So if you go to that building and you touch a black tile and you touch a silver tile, in summer, you burn yourself in the black tile. While the silver tile is it's kind of a stupid thing, but it's incredibly effective. The effect of these things is enormous, and now there are people like Ben van der, for example, who has developed a startup that has developed this ultra cool white. Have you heard of this? So basically, painting the buildings in white produces a very high albedo, and that is a very important source of mitigation of heat island effects. There are people exploring phosphorescent paintings in order to reflect, again, instead of using black asphalt, to put phosphorescent particles inside of the asphalt. Contributes to reflect the light that falls into the asphalt. And then there are kind of very traditional methods, which is basically green canopies. As green canopies also increase enormously the albedo of buildings, as you can see. I mean, this is the installation. This is the measurement of the building with a thermal camera. When the leaves grow,